Story 1.
I cautiously ran my tongue over the tips of my fangs. They had dried out completely by now. The only consolation was that the local star hadn't yet begun its brief, but painfully dangerous journey across the sky for us. I wasn't afraid of the cold. It didn't bother us. Back where I came from, the temperature was always below freezing, which suited us perfectly. Our skin is far more sensitive than that of humans, which is why the star they call the sun is deadly to us. My feet kept getting stuck in the snow, but I had no choice but to find shelter before dawn. I didn't want to die in flames and repeat the fate of hundreds of my unfortunate brothers and sisters. The night was bright enough, but luckily, the moon is harmless to us. At most, it makes our skin itch a little. However, the dense forest around here offers plenty of protection, even from that. Here's a suitable place to sleep. A sizable snowdrift with a hastily made burrow. Clearing the snow away, I crawled inside and immediately bumped into a massive, sleeping beast. It seemed that on Earth they call them bears. But that didn't matter. I had hit the jackpot. Not only shelter, but food as well. Careful not to wake the bear, I extended my fangs, feeling saliva drip down my chin, sizzling as it hit the snow. The key now was to strike the jugular, to avoid any unnecessary struggle. I gently lifted the animal's head, finding the right spot, and then sank my fangs into its throat. The blood gushed into my mouth, and I closed my eyes in ecstasy. The bear would never wake up again, and I had secured myself at least another day of life. Morning was approaching, though you could only sense it. The planet Lamaya orbited close to the star, but its temperature never rose above freezing, and its dim light was never enough to chase away the darkness of night. The star was a white dwarf, which made Lamia a perfect home for cold-blooded sanguines. Their vision allowed them to see perfectly in the dark, so the lack of light was no hindrance. Despite its harsh climate, Lamia was rich in vegetation and water. Most of the trees contained a mineral essential for the sanguines. A simple cut would release a purple sap from the tree's bark. Variel stepped out of her hut, breathing in the cold air with pleasure. Her nostrils flared and her claws scraped against the bark of a tree, leaving deep grooves from which the life-giving purple sap began to flow. Variel leaned in, letting the liquid drip onto her face. The sap served both as food and to quench their thirst. Her throat cleared, the dryness gone, and Variel straightened, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. She smiled, revealing her razor-sharp fangs, then raised her arms and jumped down onto the moss-covered ground below. Sanguines were incredibly agile and strong creatures, building their homes atop trees. No ladder was needed to descend or ascend. Just a few leaps, and they were where they needed to be. Variel stood out among her peers with an unusually strong build, effortlessly scaling any height. Her feet sank into the moss up to her ankles. Variel straightened and gazed up at the crimson sky, where wisps of clouds drifted lazily by. A beautiful sight. Aiden would have appreciated it. Variel lowered her head. How many years had it been since they'd last seen each other? Since the day Aiden had left for the hunt, there had been no word from him. The entire settlement had searched for him, scouring the area from Bone Lake to the Mail Mountains. It was all in vain. Aiden had vanished without a trace. She tried to forget, but she couldn't. Memories of their walks together, of the night spent in the abandoned Claris Tower, kept flashing before her eyes. Almost no one from the Sanguine clan dared to go there, yet Variel and Aiden had ventured inside. The main legend surrounding Claris Tower was about the creatures that had gone mad, beasts the Sanguines called Lycans. These beings resembled wolves, but were much larger, with front legs that were far longer than their hind ones. Rumor had it that the tower was their nesting ground, and that hundreds of sanguines, captured by the monsters, were imprisoned there. But Variel and Aiden had searched every corner of the tower, and found nothing that would even hint at Lycans or their victims. It was just an old, crumbling tower. Ominous, sure, but nothing more. Variel shook her head, dispelling the memories, and began walking slowly toward the edge of the forest. She reached Bone Lake. The forever frozen water shimmered slightly, reflecting the twinkling stars. She stepped onto the lake. Her claws dug into the ice, keeping her from slipping. Her gaze fell downward, and she froze. Staring back at her from beneath the ice was a black-furred face. It looked as though the creature had just fallen through the ice. But how? Variel immediately recognized a Lycan. The legend had manifested right in front of her. Yet Lamia had always been a frozen world, and Bone Lake had never thawed. Even if it had, that would have been unthinkably long ago, back when the star was not yet a white dwarf. But now, in a moment, everything had turned upside down. Variel forced herself to look away from the frozen Lycan. She turned toward the ridge, and there, against the backdrop of Claris Tower, she saw a familiar figure. So familiar that she instantly forgot about everything else. "Aiden!" she shouted. There was no response. The figure vanished. Variel shook her head. Was she imagining all this? But the Lycan, at least, was still there. She quickly made her way toward the tower. The ruins loomed over her, filling her with unease. A subtle fear stirred deep within her, but she pushed it down and stepped across the threshold of the tower. Huge columns, miraculously still standing, supported the heavy stone ceiling. Dust trickled down in small streams. Yellow grass poked through the cracks in the floor, swaying slightly in the draft. Shivering, Variel leaped across the room and landed in front of the iron door. The lock had been broken by her and Aiden during their last visit, so opening it and moving forward was easy. The path down led through a slightly sloped tunnel. Variel could clearly make out the moss-covered walls, which were riddled with holes of unknown origin. Glancing around, she made her way through the tunnel without incident and found herself in a vast hall. She remembered this room, but one thing had changed. Where the far wall had once stood, there was now a solid block of ice. As she approached, she wasn't all that surprised to find yet another Lycan frozen within. Its eyes, like the first ones, were open and staring at her. Interesting, isn't it? Variel flinched. Standing beside her was Aiden. Calmly, as if nothing had happened, he placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled that familiar smile. "Aiden," she whispered. "But how?" "Shh." He pressed a finger to his lips. "I'll explain everything later. There are more important things to deal with right now." "And what are those?" Variel regained her composure. "The Lycans? You've heard the legends of their disappearance?" She only nodded. "It's coming, Variel. Soon everything will change, and likely not for the better." "What's coming, Aiden?" "The limit." He turned and looked at the Lycan. For a moment, Variel thought she saw its eyelids twitch, but only for a second. They sat together, their backs pressed against the cold stone wall of the tower. Variel reveled in Aiden's presence. She didn't ask him anything. There was no need right now. They were together again after all those years apart. Even the word limit drifted from her mind, becoming something insignificant. It felt like Aiden was humming a song, though Variel couldn't make out the words. His voice soothed her, bringing a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. A gust of wind blew into the tower, scattering stone dust and ruffling her hair. She shuddered and opened her eyes. Aiden sat silently, his head slightly bowed. "Still?" Variel said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Tell me, what happened? Why were you gone for so long? Where were you?" Gently moving her aside, Aiden stood up and took a deep breath. "You see," he said, "for you, years have passed, but I spent only a few days in this tower." "What?" Variel jumped up, nearly losing her balance, but Aiden placed a finger to his lips, and she fell silent. "You see, this tower is not as simple as it seems, but the legends tied to it by our people are completely wrong. Claris was the last refuge of the Lycans during the limit." "So what exactly is this limit?" Variel couldn't help but ask again. "Don't be so impatient." He smirked. "You see, there was a reason I came here alone, under the guise of a hunt. Even during our first visit to the tower, I suspected it was hiding something within its depths. But that something distorts time around it. I spent all my time studying this phenomenon, and I think I figured out what it is. You see, some Lycans survived the limit, but they couldn't live on the altered planet. Most of them died. Some were frozen in the ice of once-flowing waters. Those are the ones we've seen, of course. The real mystery lies elsewhere. A small number of Lycans simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. Now, we know what happened." "Well, what was it?" Variel still sounded skeptical. It's impossible to suddenly believe that the entire history of the Sanguines, which has been taught since childhood in the institutions, turned out to be a mistake. Yes, now the existence of Lycans on Lamia is beyond doubt, but that's not enough. "The Lycans knew they couldn't survive here," Aiden continued. "So they began searching for a way to leave the planet. The most interesting part is, they succeeded. And the secret of how they did it lies here, in the Claris Tower." Variel couldn't help but laugh. This, she absolutely couldn't believe. "Oh, come on," she slapped him on the shoulder. "You know as well as I do that it's impossible to escape from Lamia. We've been wrong about a lot of things, Variel. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Come, I'll show you." And he headed straight toward the block of ice where the Lycan was frozen. Variel had no choice but to follow him. "Take my hand and step exactly where I step," Aiden instructed. Variel obeyed, and the two of them walked right through the ice, close to the frozen Lycan. Behind the wall was an enormous chamber, surprisingly intact, surrounded by stone arches. In the center of the room was a large bluish sphere, with tiny lights flickering inside it, and the air around it seemed thick and heavy. Beside the sphere, there was an inscription on the floor in a language she couldn't understand. "What is this?" Variel asked, her voice full of awe as she squeezed Aiden's hand. "The answer is right in front of you," he gestured toward the inscription. "This is the language of the Lycans. In fact, our written language evolved from theirs. Look closely, and you'll be able to understand the phrase." No matter how hard she tried, Variel couldn't make out the meaning. Finally, losing patience, Aiden guided her closer. "Look here. The letters aren't as different as they seem at first glance." Variel focused and managed to read, "The passage, our last hope. If any are still alive, simply enter the portal. There is no other salvation." A portal? To where? Now Variel no longer doubted Aiden's words. "See for yourself," Aiden smiled. "Just don't leave the confines of the sphere. It could be deadly. She let go of his hand and hesitantly approached the sphere. Its appearance, color, and the flickering lights were mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. She glanced back at Aiden. He nodded encouragingly, and Variel stepped into the sphere. Her body immediately erupted in unbearable pain. It felt as though her skin had caught fire. Unable to hold back, Variel screamed and fell to her knees. Her bones felt as though they were melting. Her vision flickered, and her hands refused to obey. With tremendous effort, she forced herself to stand. And what she saw was so astonishing that she instantly forgot the pain. Before her, a sunlit valley stretched out to the horizon. Trees, utterly different from those on Lamia, dotted the landscape. They were taller, wider, their leaves rustling in the breeze. Nearby, a river babbled, and the sound of fish splashing could be heard. All Variel wanted was to step forward, but she remembered the warning and simply closed her eyes. A second later, she realized she was lying on the floor, with Aiden leaning over her. She tried to get up but couldn't. The pain that had tormented her inside the sphere flared up again. She screamed, arching her body in agony. "Aiden, what's happening to me? Help me." A tear slid down his cheek. "I'm sorry, Variel." He shook his head. "I didn't tell you earlier. Not all sanguines can survive the transition." He pulled a dagger from his belt that had been hidden until now. "What are you doing?" she cried, struggling in vain against the pain, trying to crawl away. "Aiden, please." He shook his head and touched the blade to her skin. "I can't let you suffer." And with that, he plunged the dagger into her chest. Variel went limp, her last gaze falling on Aiden. "Woo," she whispered, and then her breathing stopped. Her eyes remained open, but they no longer saw anything. Aiden pulled the dagger free and threw it aside, then embraced the body of the sanguine who had meant more to him than anyone else on Lamia. "Forgive me. I was so sure you would make it," he sobbed. The tower trembled. A distant rumble echoed, and lightning flashed in the sky under the shining moon. Black whirlwinds began appearing everywhere, reaching almost to the ceiling. Aiden stood. Mentally, he sent a warning to all nearby sanguines. It had begun. It was around 2 a.m. and Jesse still couldn't sleep. The room was unbearably hot, and the open window didn't help. Finally, pushing the sheet aside, the boy got up and without turning on the light headed for the kitchen. He filled a glass with water from the filter and gulped it down. He felt slightly better, though not by much. On his way back, he stopped by his parents' room and knocked on the door. There was no answer. "Mom?" he called. Silence. Jesse tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed harder. Nothing. A faint fear crept over him. From inside the room, he suddenly heard a shuffling sound. Jesse stepped back. It sounded like someone was moving around lightly inside. Without trying the door again, he pressed his eye to the keyhole. Screaming, he leapt back against the wall. At that moment, the door flew open, and a tall figure loomed in the doorway. The man knelt in front of the terrified Jesse. Blood dripped from the fangs protruding from his mouth, pooling on the floor. "Sorry, kid. I didn't have a choice," the man said, and slowly walked toward the exit. On the bed lay his mother's shriveled body, her wide-open eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, devoid of life. Mommy, Jesse whispered, unable to get to his feet. "Is this the house?" Colin looked questioningly at Marty, who was the first to approach the old door. "Yeah," Marty replied after a brief pause. "Damn, I'm not even sure if it's worth going in." "Oh, don't be a coward." Anna, who had been silent until now, protested. "Come on, what's there to be afraid of? And who's going to come looking for us if we clear it out?" "All right, whatever," Marty said, as he fiddled with the lock for a few seconds with a pick, then stepped inside. His friends followed. It was dark in the hallway, but they didn't dare use their flashlights. The owner was supposedly gone, but they didn't want to take any chances. However, more puzzling than the darkness was the inexplicable cold. Their breath was visible in the air, which was more than strange. It made them uneasy, filling them with fear. But no one wanted to turn back, especially since their goal was so close. "We need to go upstairs," Colin whispered for some reason and finally turned on his flashlight. The beam revealed a dust-covered spiral staircase and cobwebs in the corners. "Gross," Anna muttered in disgust. "How can anyone live in such filth?" "Forget it. Everyone's got their quirks," Marty said as he started up the stairs. And Anna, despite her revulsion, followed. Colin brought up the rear. The second floor was no different from the first, just as neglected, dusty, dirty, and full of cobwebs, and just as unnervingly cold. What the hell are we even hoping to find in this tomb? Marty was nervous, which made him angry. "Colin, you dragged us here. Show us the stash." Without responding, Colin turned left, walked to the end of the hallway, and opened the door on the right. The friends found themselves in a bedroom. Unlike the rest of the house, it was tastefully furnished. Red tapestries depicting various animals hung on the walls. A heavy chandelier dangled from the ceiling, and a large bed stood proudly with a canopy. In the corner was an enormous wooden wardrobe. "Now this I can appreciate," Anna said in awe. "At least he takes care of something. A bedroom is still a bedroom." "What now?" Marty interrupted her. Colin approached the bed and grabbed one of the legs. "Come on, help me out." Together, the friends managed to move the heavy piece of furniture. Under the bed was an iron hatch, which surprisingly opened with ease. Inside the niche was a silk-lined box, surrounded by an inscription in a language they didn't recognize. They didn't have time to open the box before footsteps echoed from the staircase. "What the hell?" Colin whispered. "You said he was gone." "He was," Marty said, spreading his hands in confusion. "Damn it, we've got to hide. Quick." "What about the bed?" Cursing under his breath, Marty hurriedly pushed it back into place. Anna quickly darted into the wardrobe. Marty hid behind the curtains, and Colin slipped under the bed. They heard someone enter the bedroom. A heavy sigh, and Colin felt the bed above him sag slightly. Holding his breath, he even covered his mouth with his hand to stay as quiet as possible. Anna peeked through a small gap in the wardrobe's wooden slats. Lying on the bed was a tall man, dressed in a gray cloak and dark red trousers. She couldn't see his face, but he seemed to be about 30 years old. For some reason, he was wearing black gloves. A strange sense of unease gripped her, and it wasn't just because of how poorly they had hidden. There was something off about the stranger. An odd energy seemed to emanate from him. She almost felt it, her hair standing on end as though a light electric current had passed through her. Suddenly, the man jumped to his feet. Before Marty or Anna could react, he effortlessly tossed the bed aside and grabbed Colin by the throat. "Trying to hide, little thief," the man hissed. "Futile." In the next instant, a chair came crashing down on his head. He staggered and let go of Colin. Without a word, the friends bolted from the bedroom. Marty wasn't fast enough, and the owner of the house grabbed him from behind. "Got one." Marty felt something sharp sink into his neck. Hot blood spilled onto the floor, and his vision darkened. A lone figure approached the house. A young man, no older than 20, held a long knife in his hand. Hearing the scream, he rushed inside. "I've finally found you," he hissed. "Don't think you'll kill anyone else." Anna and Colin had gotten separated, even though they hadn't intended to. But the darkness worked its magic, and they ended up at opposite ends of the house. Anna was crying, her mind still filled with the pale, terrified face of Marty. Everything had gone wrong. He had warned them not to come here. But how could they resist such a tempting opportunity? This house had always been avoided, and if they got lucky, the police wouldn't even bother looking for them. Who could have guessed the owner would return so soon? And who, or what, he would turn out to be? You can't predict everything in life, especially not this. Hearing footsteps on the stairs, Anna shrank into a corner, trying her best not to make a sound. But as she squinted into the darkness, she realized it wasn't the vampire. A young man was coming up the stairs holding a long knife. Who was he? And why was he here? "Hey," she whispered. The guy flinched and turned around. "Who's there?" Anna stepped out of her hiding place. The stranger exhaled in relief, but he didn't put the knife away. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name's Anna," she said, feeling a bit more secure. There was something about this guy that radiated confidence and calm. It allowed her to relax. "There were 3 of us, but one of my friends is dead," she added, surprised at how flat her voice sounded. "The other one is somewhere in the house, but I don't know where." "Well, since we're doing introductions, I'm Jesse," he said with a slight smile, though his face quickly turned suspicious again. "What were the 3 of you even doing here? You hunting him too?" "No, that seems unlikely." "No, we had no idea who he was. We were just burglars," Jesse finished for her. Anna nodded. "Well, I guess the robbery didn't go as planned. Come on, let's go find your friend." They headed upstairs. "Colin!" Anna shouted, but only the echo responded. Jesse didn't ask her to keep quiet. He knew the vampire was well aware of where they were. The question was, what was he waiting for? Suddenly, a faint groan came from behind a door on the right. "Colin!" Anna called again as she flung the door open. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, holding his neck with one hand. Blood seeped through his fingers, pooling beneath him. "Anna, run. Get out," he whispered before falling silent. His eyes glazed over. "There's nothing we can do for him," Jesse said, shaking his head. "But we can avenge him." "Avenge?" Anna's eyes widened as she looked at the boy. "How do you plan to do that? You didn't see his strength." "Oh, I've seen it all right," Jesse said, grabbing her hand. "Here's the deal. I'll help you get out, and I'll settle my own score with him. Deal?" "Deal. Do whatever you want, but I'm getting the hell out of here." They stepped back into the hallway. They had barely reached the stairs when the figure of the house's owner appeared before them. "Going somewhere, kids?" Jesse, letting go of Anna, lunged at his old enemy with the knife, but the vampire easily knocked the weapon from his hand. The next second, a powerful blow to Jesse's chest sent him flying backward. "That was too easy," the vampire said, approaching the frozen Anna. He took her chin in his hand. "You know, you look so much like her. What a strange coincidence, seeing her almost double on Earth." "Please," Anna whimpered, "don't hurt me. I'm begging you." "What do you know about pain?" he roared, throwing her to the floor. Have you ever watched your world die? Have you ever had the one you loved most die in your arms? Don't you dare speak to me about pain, you pathetic creature." Anna tried to crawl away, but he pinned her to the ground with his foot. "Now die, little thief. I might not even bother feeding on you." But before he could finish, Jesse, regaining consciousness, crashed into him from behind, and they both tumbled down the stairs. "Run!" Jesse shouted as the fall ended. Anna tried to get up, but her back exploded with pain, and with a cry, she collapsed again. It seemed the vampire had injured her spine. Meanwhile, the owner of the house grabbed Jesse by the throat and hoisted him into the air. "What did you think you could accomplish, fool?" the vampire sneered. "Go to hell," Jesse hissed, struggling in vain to break free. With monstrous force, the vampire's clenched fist struck Jesse's abdomen, punching through him. Blood poured from his mouth, his organs spilling out as the vampire released his lifeless body. Then, he turned back toward Anna. "It's always such a pity that it ends like this," he whispered in her ear. He picked up Jesse's knife, flipped Anna onto her back, and slowly drove the blade into her chest. She gasped one last time before falling silent. Returning to the bedroom, the vampire pulled the box out from under the bed. He opened it and took out a small painting, one that showed him and a woman standing in front of a half-ruined tower on a mountainside. "Very ill," he whispered.
Story 2.
I grew up in a poor family. My father was just a carpenter. He barely managed to work during the day and spent his evenings drinking away his money in a local tavern. My mother was gravely ill, and the most she could do was handle small household chores with me. My parents argued often. When emotions run high, adults don't realize that children suffer the most. When I saw them fail to find common ground once again, a storm of negative emotions brewed inside me. Fear, anger, anxiety. I didn't know how to deal with it. I understood that no family was perfect, full of understanding, trust, and love, but it weighed on me. I began to feel more and more like I was the only one in the world like this. I loved to read, reflecting on everything that I pictured in my mind. That was my little world. Neither my parents nor anyone else could tear it apart. It was a world without anger, fear, or despair. A world where everyone was happy. But what did I know of happiness? My mother passed away when I turned 18. We buried her in the local cemetery. My father had little interest in my future. His friends started coming over to our house, spending evenings playing cards and passing one bottle after another. I couldn't stand the drunken haze, so every night I locked myself in my room, and in the mornings I had to clean the chairs and sofas that reeked of alcohol and tobacco. My father grew harsher with me. After my mother's death, there was no one else to vent his drunken fits on. Anytime I tried to assert that I was an adult or refused to follow his orders, I got hit on the back of my head. He would yell at me in front of others, feeling no remorse. I harbored thoughts of childish revenge deep within my soul, but my fear of him always killed those ideas. So I found no better option than to run away. It seemed like anywhere else would be more welcoming than my own home. One night my father came home completely drunk and collapsed onto his bed, mumbling something to himself before passing out. Realizing this was my chance, I packed my things and slipped out of the house, quietly closing the door behind me. It was late, and the full moon hung in the sky. It was breathtakingly beautiful, offering perfect solitude and peace. One of the best gifts the moon gives to those who watch it. I took with me only a bag containing my documents and some money I found hidden in my father's stash. Without a second thought, I set out into the unknown. I wandered for a long time. The very thought of being free like a bird warmed me during those dark nights. Cities, villages, estates, markets, taverns. I visited them all in search of work. I was starting to regret leaving home when one day an old man approached me. I was sitting by the roadside, finishing the last bits of dried fish. "I can tell you're in despair," he said. I had nothing to hide, so I told him about how I was wandering the world in search of a better life, how no one would give me work, and how I was sitting there not knowing where to go next. "You stole that fish, didn't you?" The old man looked at me with disapproval. Shamefully, I lowered my gaze. My money had long run out, and I had no other option. I nodded, ashamed, and promised that one day I'd find my place, and then my life would change. "You know, as one wise man said, life is what happens to us while we're busy making plans for the future," the old man chuckled. I looked into his eyes and realized he wasn't judging me. He understood me. That's what I'd been missing all these years since my mother died. The old man offered to help me, and I felt drawn to him. I started living with him. I had my own room. I helped him around the house, washed clothes, and cooked meals. He never yelled at me or belittled me. I felt fatherly love for the first time and obeyed him in everything. It was the life I had always dreamed of but never had. The old man's house was full of treasures and ancient trinkets. I grew curious about where it all came from and began asking him questions. He always lowered his head and avoided answering. I sensed that he didn't want to talk about it, as if it was a dark chapter of his past. But one late evening, my curiosity got the better of me. He told me about his difficult childhood. We were alike. As a child, he had found himself on the streets and had started stealing. He was patient and inquisitive, and soon found friends who were like him. He spent a lot of time with hustlers, pickpockets, and con men. Over the years, he perfected his thievery skills. He could slip into homes unnoticed, like a shadow. He would take money, jewels, antiques, and even fine clothes. He sold whatever he could on the black market and kept the rest. That's when I understood how he knew that the fish wasn't mine. But who was I to judge him? "Teach me," I said, surprising even myself. The old man looked at me with astonishment. "This will lead to no good. Your life will change completely," he warned. I understood, but I was determined, and the old man couldn't refuse me. So began the long days, weeks, and months of my training. From a simple pickpocket at the market to a skilled card shark, I quickly mastered many skills under the old man's careful guidance. The training in nighttime house break-ins was especially intriguing. The old man made me wake up late at night and carefully search the house as if I were looking for valuables. He was a light sleeper, so I failed many attempts. It would always end with him placing a hand on my shoulder, waking from the sound of my steps, and saying, "Failed." Time passed, and my skills improved. I even robbed a house nearby. It wasn't hard, though the old man scolded me harshly. He said that these things should only be done with experience. You had to observe the residents, make sure there were no police stations nearby, confirm the house had no alarms, and weigh all the risks. If even one parameter didn't fit, you had to leave it alone. But I had already tasted the thrill, so I quietly listened, my head down, thinking about which house would be next. One day I decided to take a walk and wandered far from home. I reflected on my life, the before and the after, how it had changed, and what I had become. Had I become a happy man who had found a close friend? Or was I just another petty thief who knew nothing else? And then I saw it, a massive house standing alone at the end of the street. It was old and beautiful, as if time had stopped around it. though it looked as though construction had finished only yesterday. There were intricate symbols carved into the window ledges, but I didn't understand their meaning. The building was impressive, its architecture unlike anything I had ever seen. The road to the house was blocked by a ridiculously low fence, so low that even a child could easily climb over it and enter the yard. I returned home and casually mentioned what I had seen. The old man looked at me disapprovingly, but I reassured him. I was just struck by its size. I don't even know who lives there. He told me that a family had moved in a long time ago. They lived reclusively and rarely went outside. I was surprised. They must be hiding something, I thought, considering how enormous the house was. My mind began to form a plan. It dragged on for a while. I started visiting the house during the day, spending hours observing it. I never once saw anyone enter or leave, though occasionally silhouettes would move behind the dark matte curtains. Then I started coming at night. The lights were on, but those damn curtains never opened. I counted several figures inside, but I couldn't piece together a full picture. After circling the house several times, I found no signs of surveillance or alarms. It was far from other homes, and being on the edge of town, there was no question of nearby police. Well, I thought, it checks all the boxes. All that was left was to set a plan in motion, and one quickly formed in my mind. That night, once the old man had fallen asleep, I gathered my few tools, lockpicks and gloves, dressed comfortably, and quietly left the house. The weather had taken a turn for the worse. Heavy rain poured down, and the sky flickered with lightning, momentarily lighting up the darkness. It was well past midnight, and the air was filled with a strange sense of the unknown. I easily jumped over the low fence and headed toward the house. There were no lights in the windows, and I sighed in relief. Beautiful flower beds lined the path to the front door. The flowers had long withered, and I smirked to myself. Couldn't even bother to water the flowers. I approached the porch, illuminated by a small lamp, took off my bag, and pulled out a lockpick. I was surprised by how unusual the lock on the door was. It didn't look like an ordinary one. The vertical mechanism didn't even have a visible keyhole, as if it wasn't supposed to. I pressed the handle, hoping the door would turn, and at that moment, it swung open. I froze. They hadn't even locked the door. They really must not have their wits about them. Quietly opening the door, I realized that the weather couldn't have been more perfect. The lightning occasionally illuminated the interior, allowing me to see everything clearly. I found myself in what seemed to be a living room. There were many antique items. A couch covered in faded fabric sat in the room. Old clocks on the wall ticked softly, marking the time. A large table stood in the center of the room. Little trinkets and figurines were scattered all around. There was a hair comb here, and over there, a book with a dried flower between its pages. Some of the items on the shelf beneath the clock looked incredibly valuable. They exuded the scent of centuries past. I quietly moved forward, opened my bag, and began to carefully gather everything without making a sound. Thankfully, my training had paid off. After sweeping through the entire living room and filling my bag to the brim, I grabbed a couple of strange rings from the table. I couldn't tell what they were made of, but they looked impressive and were quite heavy. A very wide staircase carpeted with a runner led upstairs. I didn't dare go up, fearing I might wake someone. The house was enormous and old. Any creak could easily give me away. I was already heading toward the exit when I heard a faint sound. I stopped to listen. Through the rumble of thunder, it was nearly impossible to make out. but it sounded like a human moan. I froze, glancing around the room, but saw no one. I must be hearing things, I whispered to myself. But then I heard it again. Heading deeper into the living room, the sound became clearer. Damn it, there were definitely human voices. On the right side of the staircase stood a large iron door with a lock, and I could swear the moans were coming from behind it. Deciding it wasn't my business, I wasn't exactly a guest here, I turned to leave. But then I heard a distinct, "Help me." I shuddered, and without thinking twice, dropped my bag and pulled out my lockpicks. The lock on the door was simple, and within seconds, I had it open. At first, I couldn't see anything because the room was pitch black, but when the sky lit up with another flash of lightning, I was struck by a horrifying sight. Several people were chained by their wrists and necks to the walls. Some of them were covered in blood. Exhausted and weak, they didn't move, only casting desperate, pleading looks my way. Only one of them was groaning. I was terrified. Where the hell am I? What's going on here? Who are these people? I won't lie, I was scared out of my mind. In complete confusion, I took a step back. My only thought was to get the hell out of there immediately. I turned and headed for the door. When I opened it, I jerked back in surprise. A girl stood there with her back to me, not moving. As she heard my footsteps, she turned around. Her arms were crossed, gripping her forearms as if she were cold. I couldn't make out her face, but she was slender, with skin as pale as chalk. She wore tall black boots, jeans, and a dark blue tank top. Her ears sparkled with pale blue earrings, made from some sort of dark crystal. "Apologies for my appearance, but we weren't expecting guests," she said with a smirk. The lightning illuminated her face, and I recoiled in horror. Her snow-white fangs gleamed, and her eyes were bloodshot. I stumbled backward, only to bump into someone. In the next moment, everything went dark as I was struck and fell unconscious. I woke up chained to a post. Judging by the decor, I was still in the same house. My head throbbed painfully, especially at the back. The blow had been hard. It was morning outside, but thick curtains blocked the sunlight from entering the room, making it only slightly brighter than night. My vision was blurry, and I struggled to see clearly. When everything finally came into focus, I shuddered and screamed. Not far from me, several people sat on a large sofa, staring at me with mocking expressions. A short guy squatted next to me, studying my face. "Who are you?" I yelled, rattling the chains and naively trying to free myself. A girl with platinum blonde hair stood up and approached me, humming something softly. "He smells delicious," she said, sniffing me. I instinctively shrank back against the wall. "Stacy, leave him alone," came a stern voice as the woman I had encountered at the porch entered the room. "Forgive me, pure blood." Stacy stepped back, lowering her head. "Why are we wasting time, Monica?" "He tried to rob us," said a tall guy with light hair, dumping the contents of my bag onto the table. "He even took the moonstone." "Shut your mouth, half-blood, or have you forgotten your place?" Monica snapped. The guy lowered his head in silence. "His fate will be decided by the elders, or have you forgotten the rules?" Now I understood who was in charge here. I stared at them in bewilderment, feeling both terrified and amused. What kind of circus was this? "He's timid. I can only imagine what he's feeling right now," laughed the girl on the sofa, eyeing me hungrily. I couldn't take it anymore. "Listen, if this is some kind of cosplay, I'll give you credit. You've nailed it. I know I was wrong, but take these chains off, and let's talk like civilized people." A brief silence followed, only to be interrupted by a burst of laughter. "Quiet," Monica commanded, her tone deadly serious. "So you think you broke into our house to rob us, and now we've captured you to put on a cosplay show?" Her words carried no trace of humor. "Look, I'll take responsibility for my actions, but take the chains off. I didn't hurt anyone, so let's be reasonable," I pleaded, feeling their intense gazes on me. At that moment, the girl from the door appeared right in front of me. Startled, I flinched in horror. She grabbed me by the throat, squeezing so hard I nearly blacked out. "Reasonable? I'd rather die than lower myself to your level, you filthy scum," she hissed in my ear. I nodded frantically, just wanting her to let go. "When's the next full moon, Indy?" she called out. The girl started flipping through a calendar. "In 3 days." "Perfect, he'll make a fine feast. Keep an eye on him, Keel. I'll ask the elders for this favor on your behalf." The boy squatting next to me nodded gratefully. Everyone bowed and Monica left the room. "You really thought we were human?" the boy in glasses asked, adjusting them as if there was something unnatural about doing so. But I was beginning to understand. "So what are you?" I asked with a smirk. "We're vampires, my friend. You broke into the wrong house, but hey, here's the good news. You'll die with honor." Stacy chimed in. "Yes, I'll drink you if the elders approve," the boy with glasses said with a grin. I laughed. Fear and amusement mixed together inside me. Vampires don't exist. They're just stories made up by writers to entertain people. "Is that so? Well, he's a well-read one, isn't he?" Indy laughed. "Yeah, I read a lot and I know what I'm talking about." "Oh, really? And what have you read?" "Dracula?" asked the guy with light hair. "He's going to die soon anyway," Stacy giggled. "Yes," I yelled. "Dracula is the iconic vampire figure created by the writer Bram Stoker, a count from Transylvania who drank blood and turned people into vampires, created by a writer. You hear me?" "But Dracula isn't just a writer's invention," Indy said. "The literary character had a real-life inspiration." "I know. Vlad the Impaler. He was a brutal tyrant who staged gruesome public executions, impaling the heads of his enemies on stakes. He was so bloodthirsty that his own people eventually decided it was better to kill him, sending his head to the Turks, with whom he'd fought successfully. But you won't find a single historical record or fact confirming that he drank blood. That part was made up to turn him into a legendary figure." They bared their fangs at me as they listened. But I wasn't a fool. I knew exactly where I was. I wasn't sure what I was trying to prove to myself. I just wanted to open my eyes and wake up from this nightmare. When they left to feed, only the boy in glasses remained with me. "Please, just tell me where I am," I asked, my voice weary. He seemed to pity me. He brought me some food and water. "This is a coven. We're a family. Monica and Stacy are purebloods, but Monica is much older, so she's in charge. Purebloods are the highest class of vampires. They're the founders of the coven and keep its ancient traditions alive. Matt and Indy are half-bloods. They're lower in the hierarchy, born from a pure-blood vampire and a human. They feed on both food and blood, which is why I brought you something to eat. There are 2 others, but they're currently serving the elders." "And who are you?" I asked in surprise. "I'm just a regular-turned vampire. I was born just like you, an ordinary human." "So they don't treat you as an equal?" "You don't understand. No vampire rank considers those of other ranks as equals. But soon I'll fully join the family. I just need to undergo the initiation during the full moon." I realized that he meant I was part of that initiation. "And who are the elders?" I asked. "Trust me, you don't want to meet them. The elders are the founders of all the blood clans, the ancestors of all purebloods. No one knows exactly where they came from. According to legend, they were turned by the first vampire. Their power is absolute." "So there's only one outcome for me?" I asked. "It's an honor to be part of the ceremony. People turned during the full moon for the initiation of ordinary vampires will always be revered." Well, that was some news, but it didn't bring me any comfort. The chains holding me were strong enough to restrain a buffalo, and all I could do was sit and wait for the inevitable. The days passed by in a blur. The vampires were only active at night. I constantly heard their footsteps, their conversations, and the groans of the people in the room I had seen. Now I understood that to them, these weren't people but merely food. On top of that, Indy constantly carried medical blood bags at night, so they never ran out of their primary sustenance. If you didn't know they were vampires, you'd never guess it. They seemed like a normal family, sitting together in the evenings with glasses of fine wine, laughing and playing games. The only thing that struck me was the power Monica wielded. Everyone obeyed her without question. Only Stacy appeared to be her equal. Monica barely paid attention to me, as if I weren't worth her time. I often saw her with a baby in her arms, constantly on the phone, trying to soothe the child when it cried, showing it toys to calm it down. I often spoke with Keel, who told me about the supernatural strength and speed vampires possessed, along with their superior hearing and sense of smell compared to humans. They could regenerate from injuries and were immune to all poisons and radiation, except sunlight. That was the one thing they feared. Even the most powerful vampire couldn't risk walking in daylight. Then, my last day on Earth arrived. As usual, they brought me food and water in the morning. I have to admit, they never mistreated me. They fed me and treated me with respect, despite the fact that I was a prisoner awaiting my fate. Except for Monica, of course. They were all very cultured, speaking to me as if I were an unfortunate guest rather than a thief they had caught. Perhaps it was because I was to receive a high honor during the full moon. I wasn't sure. Late that night, they took me outside and we headed deep into the forest. We walked for a long time along dark paths, winding through the woods under the light of the full moon. My procession to my final fate was accompanied by the crying of the baby Monica had brought with her for some reason. I hope he won't have to watch, I thought. As the moon sank lower, becoming even more beautiful, we arrived at a flat clearing surrounded by trees. Monica handed the baby to Stacy and pulled out an ancient book. The vampires formed a circle around me as she began to read from it. I braced myself for the end. The chains were gone, and my hands were free. But where could I run? I wouldn't make it 5 steps. "It's time," Monica commanded, snapping the book shut. Keel stepped forward and I looked up, hoping to catch one last glimpse of the full moon. And then we heard it, a faint howl in the distance. It grew louder with each passing second. The vampires started moving in all directions, whispering to one another. "Werewolves," the boy with glasses whispered. "You've got to be kidding me." As if things weren't bad enough. Monica placed the baby down beside me. "If you touch him, you're dead. Understand?" The vampires lined up, baring their fangs. Their eyes glowed like beacons in the dark. From the shadowy forest, I saw bright red eyes appear. Massive werewolves, werewolves, emerged, covered in coarse fur, their legs unnaturally bent forward. I've never seen them this big, Indy muttered, bewildered. It's the full moon, Stacy hissed back. They charged at us so fast that I could barely believe my eyes. Lycans! Matt shouted. The vampires rushed to meet them, and the battle erupted into a whirlwind of chaos. Howls and growls filled the night as blood sprayed in every direction, seemingly blotting out the sky. I had no idea how the Lycans could tell the vampires apart. They moved with such speed that it was impossible to follow. Their glowing eyes cut through the darkness like knives. I could only glimpse a vampire for a split second before a Lycan fell dead. But there were so many, too many. They poured out of the forest, and it seemed like the attack would never end. Wounded Lycans stood back up within moments, their wounds healing before my eyes. The child screamed and wailed. Now I understood why Monica had placed him next to me. It was the safest place in this bloodbath. The child. The child. A huge Lycan growled. Anyone who lunged toward the baby fell instantly, decapitated. I glimpsed Monica's blood-stained face, her red eyes blazing with fury. She was unstoppable. Sooner or later she won't be able to protect him, I thought grimly. I was terrified. It seemed like the massacre would never end, and I realized this was my only chance to survive. I grabbed the baby, clutching him to my chest, and sprinted toward the forest, back the way we had come. The piercing screams behind me didn't stop, but I kept running. The child cried, screamed, and bit at me, sensing a stranger. But I couldn't calm him. I just held him tighter, terrified that we'd be caught. Leaping over a small rise, I froze. In front of me stood an old man with silver hair, wearing a long black cloak. His face was pale, with deep wrinkles marking his age. His fangs, yellowed and dull, didn't shine like the others. I immediately knew who he was, but I didn't want to believe it. The child in my arms quieted. I bent down and placed him before the old man. The sounds of battle behind me had ceased, and the vampires soon appeared, covered in blood, searching for me. I saw the shock and fear in their eyes when they realized who stood before me. They all bowed their heads in silence. Monica grabbed me by the throat, lifting me off the ground. "Did you forget what I told you, you piece of filth?" Monica's bloodied face was filled with rage. "I don't think I was mistaken when I said we honor our traditions." The old man spoke softly. Monica sniffed the air and lowered me to the ground, bowing her head. I knew it. He was one of the elders. I had read that they could live for up to 3,000 years, but I could never have imagined standing face to face with one. Monica picked up the baby, and the vampires disappeared silently into the woods. I wandered through the forest trying to find a way out. Eventually, I came upon a fork in the road and headed home. I thought about the old man. Was he worried about me? He must have been looking for me by now. Hungry, dirty, and exhausted, I finally reached the house. The old man was sitting in the yard, gazing up at the night sky. "God, I thought you'd abandoned me." He stood up and came over to me, his eyes full of joy. I was overwhelmed with a storm of emotions, too much to speak. We embraced tightly. I loved him more than I ever loved my own father. But something was wrong. I felt the blood pumping through my veins, this insatiable thirst. I couldn't fight it. The scent of his blood called to me, leaving me with no choice, and I bit into his neck. The old man screamed. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, but I didn't let go. When the thirst finally faded, he fell limp. 2 tiny red marks were left on my wrist. The fear from the child had done something to me, but I had never felt more alive than I did at that moment. I lifted my head and looked up at the moon. My eyes filled with blood and it turned crimson. The perfect solitude and peace, the greatest gift the moon could give.